It's a place where the cold is so intense that it corrupts the soul, a place where human nature shows its extraordinary fragility, a place where, according to one of its residents, a human being can turn into a beast after 3 weeks of hard work, starvation, and beatings. The place I'm describing is one of the easternmost regions of Russia and was almost entirely uninhabited until the start of the 20th century when prospectors first found precious metal. In any other place, or at any other time, it could have become a land of plenty and opportunity. Instead, it became a sprawling region of despair and meaningless death, home to hundreds of thousands of slaves forced to toil in labor camps. Welcome to Kolyma, the land of gold and gulags. Where is Kolyma, and what makes it special? Kolyma is a vast area, larger than France, situated in the far east of Russia, at the most remote end of Siberia. The area takes its name after the Kolyma River and the Kolyma mountain range. The largest inhabited center is the regional capital of Magadan, 6,000 kilometers or 3,700 miles from Moscow. To give you an idea of the distance, you could fit the entire United States between Moscow and Magadan with enough room left over for Mexico on both sides. The precise coordinates of Magadan are 59.56 degrees north and 150.83 degrees east. 59 degrees north is the same latitude as the Orkney Islands off Scotland, Stockholm in Sweden, and the Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. In other words, this is very far north and it's very, very cold. The average temperature in and around Magadan in January is minus 17 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the average temperature, meaning temperatures can easily fall below minus 30 Celsius or minus 22 Fahrenheit. This is a coastal town we're talking about, so the weather there is relatively mild. As you move inland, conditions can become much, much harsher. Winter can start as early as September or sometimes even in August. As the mercury creeps below freezing, the landscape is covered in a glassy shroud of ice which doesn't thaw out until May. Snowstorms are frequent and arrive without warning, surprising travelers in a swirling whiteout. There is a danger of losing all sense of direction after walking just a few paces in these unforgiving conditions. In summer, temperatures in Magadan only climb up as far as 12 degrees Celsius or 54 Fahrenheit, but these are averages, and exceptionally hot summers have been recorded in the past, averaging at 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit. What makes it difficult to trek, travel, or work in Kolyma, especially in its woodlands, is the extreme humidity. After a typical dry March, precipitation gradually increases from April to September. Below the topmost layer of soil, the Kolyma wilderness is covered by a thick layer of permafrost which prevents rain from seeping into the ground. Thus, the woods actually become huge swamps infested by clouds of midges. This inconvenience aside, the natural beauty of Kolyma is striking, with its deep, clean rivers and sprawling taiga, which is the woodlands typical of Arctic and subarctic areas. In addition to natural riches, this area can boast plenty of material ones. The area is ripe with tungsten, platinum, and gold. It was the discovery of these metals that kicked off Russia's own gold rush, which was very different from the one which took place in America. In Alaska and California, the discovery of gold stimulated private initiative and fueled a capitalist system. Here in Kolyma, the hunt for the shiny stuff happens in the context of a planned economy. The rush was specifically designed to feed a communist totalitarian state. Eventually, this led to the ultimate distortion of socialist ideals, the creation of 80 labor camps or gulags in Kolyma. The details of the first discovery of gold in Kolyma are lost to legend. Tales are told of an adventurer called Boris, a gold digger by profession, who went to Kolyma in the summer of 1910. A short time later, he moved to Yakutsk, 2,000 kilometers, that's 1,250 miles west of Magadan, carrying a considerable amount of gold with him. Boris's good fortune did not initially create any sort of mad gold rush. He was pestered by his friends about where he'd found the gold, but he always kept it quiet. The secret of Kolyma would be safe for another 12 years. Then in 1922, as the Russian Civil War was concluding, the Red Army had already won in the Russian Far East and forced the opposing White Army to retreat to Vladivostok. One of the officers separated from the main white column and headed to Ustnira instead, a town deep in the heart of Kolyma. Again, the details are sketchy here. We only note that his name was Nikolaev, but it's not clear why he went so far from Vladivostok. What is clear, though, is that in Ustnira, Officer Nikolaev not only struck gold, he also struck platinum. Following in the footsteps of the mythical Boris, the white officer went to Yakutsk to secure his booty in a bank. Then he surrendered to the Red Army, probably hoping to secure a pardon thanks to his discoveries. Unfortunately for Officer Nikolaev, the Red Army is not exactly a charitable outfit renowned throughout history for the clemency that it shows its opponents, especially if they were Tsarist loyalists. Therefore, it's unsurprising to learn that Officer Nikolaev disappeared from history after his surrender. His fate is unknown, but we know for sure that the new regime in Moscow welcomed his metallic discovery. By the mid-20s, the Bolshevik government under Joseph Stalin was seeking volunteers for a gold-finding expedition to Kolyma. The gold-digging party eventually reached Kolyma and proceeded to map out the region, which still lay largely unexplored. They first built a small settlement called Boriskin in honor of the very first gold prospector in the region. Eventually, they built a road connecting Boriskin to Okhotsk, a coastal town west of Magadan. During their exploration, these Boriskinians discovered a completely unknown chain of mountains, the Chesky Range. It was the last time a mountain range was to be discovered anywhere on our planet. Among the volunteers in this expedition, there was a geologist, Yuri Bilibin. Based on his findings, he concluded that the subsoil of Kolyma contained more gold than the remaining territory of the entire Soviet Union. Despite this shocking and encouraging realization, the volunteers at Boriskin did not have enough resources to properly mine Kolyma, so by 1928, the expedition was recalled. Stalin and the Politburo were very keen on tapping Kolyma's precious minerals, so they changed tactics. Instead of relying on volunteers, they would establish a new state-owned trust fully dedicated to managing and exploiting the mines of Kolyma. In 1931, Stalin signed the order establishing this trust called Dalstroy, or Far North Construction Trust. At first sight, it may appear odd that an order related to state-owned mines was issued by Genrikh Yagoda, the head of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police. Based on what we know today, any piece of paper issued by Yagoda, a Berger, or any other of Stalin's chief thugs and signed by the Man of Steel himself, well, that piece of paper could only mean bad news. Such an order can only result in imprisonment, torture, slavery, and death. The Dalstroy order was not the exception. The involvement of Yagoda made it clear from the start that the new construction trust would be relying on forced labor. And forced labor, it meant gulags. If you're not familiar with Soviet gulags, here is a crash course on the topic. The word gulag is an acronym that stands for Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps and Colonies. You can see the original Russian on the screen right now, and I'm not going to try and read it. The Gulag System was a network of forced labor camps where both common criminals and political dissenters were sent to work in inhuman conditions. The term Gulag was first used in 1928, but the practice of locking up political prisoners in labor camps started immediately after the October 1917 revolution. In his great work, The Gulag Archipelago, Nobel laureate and former prisoner Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote that Soviet Russia had more prisoners than the rest of the world combined as early as 1919. By that same year, the Bolshevik regime had murdered more political opponents than the whole Romanov dynasty during their 300-year reign. Unlike the Nazi lagers, the gulags were never designed as a machine for systematic extermination. Their purpose was to exploit to the very last drop of energy the forced labor of the prisoners. These prisoners were also known as zeks. Death was not the objective, but it was an all-too-common consequence. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens were tortured, beaten, starved, frozen, or simply worked to death. The Gulag system boomed during the Stalin era from 1924 to 1953. A paranoid, ruthless, and at times criminally incompetent leader, the self-appointed Man of Steel dedicated large parts of the 1930s to waging a war of extermination against his own people. From 1929 to 1935, Stalin ordered a forced collectivization of farmland, which implied a liquidation of the kulaks, the small landowners. Hundreds of thousands of these farmers were deported to labor camps for refusing to cede their lands or even just a part of their crops to the state. The collectivization resulted in mismanagement of farmland. As a result, there were some truly terrible famines, like the Ukrainian Holodomor, which resulted in some 10 million deaths. From 1934 to 1938, Stalin conducted the Great Purge, a campaign of arrests, deportations, and executions to rid Soviet institutions of alleged capitalists, fascists, or other enemies. Between 750,000 and 1.5 million victims died, either directly by the hands of the NKVD or by being worked to death in the gulags. The collectivization and the Great Purge are only two examples of Soviet-era mass incarcerations. The risk of being arrested and deported to a labor camp was an ever-present danger for Soviet citizens who could fall foul of the NKVD for a number of petty reasons. Alleged enemies of communism would be judged by special tribunals who almost always found them guilty. Sentences were commonly harsh, ranging from 8 years to 50 years long. Take these examples. In 1949, beekeeper Ivan Berilov cast his vote in one of many ridiculous and rigged elections where citizens had the choice of just one candidate. Berilov simply wrote comedy on his ballot sheet. He was sentenced to 8 years in a gulag. Believe it or not, he was relatively lucky. Directing humor against a specific party official could result in 25 years of hard labor. A recurring crime was stealing food, as in the case of Maria Chebotareva, a victim of the 1932 to 1933 famine. Maria stole 3 pounds of rye to feed her children. Actually, she didn't even steal them. She just took them from a field that was rightfully hers but had been confiscated by the state. She was sentenced to 10 years in a gulag, a stint that was arbitrarily extended until 1945, followed by 11 years of forced exile. She was free to return home in 1956, but never found her children again. Women had an especially hard time in the gulags, as in many cases they were not housed in separate facilities but shared working and accommodation structures with the male zeks. Women were often molested, abused, or raped by camp guards or fellow inmates. A common practice for female prisoners was to take on camp husbands for protection and companionship. If they became pregnant while in the gulag, female prisoners and their children could be released in special amnesties. But this was not the norm. More frequently, new mothers simply returned straight to work, while gulag officials placed the babies in special orphanages. Instances of rape and sexual abuse were just one example of prisoner-on-prisoner violence inside the gulags. This was surely due to the desperate conditions of the prisoners, who could turn on one another for an extra ration of food. As is the case in other prisons, snitches could be gruesomely punished. A common example was the close shave, i.e. removal of the moustache and the full upper lip from a man's face. Another contributing factor in gulag violence was the close proximity of common criminals with political inmates. The two groups were not separated and received similar treatment. Accordingly, hardened felons would bully and prey on ordinary citizens who may have simply been imprisoned for telling a joke at the wrong time. So let's fly back to Kolyma. The first wave of prisoners arrived there on the 22nd of April 1932, landing on Navago Bay. The numbers are disputed, but by the end of the year, there were around 12,000 surviving zeks, and I stress surviving here. The hardships these prisoners faced were enormous, so it is likely that these 12,000 were just a fraction of those who had set foot there initially. The prisoners did not start mining immediately, simply because infrastructure was completely lacking. Even if these prisoners were destined to go to a labor camp, it really didn't exist yet. It would therefore be the Zek's duty to build it. But first, the mining trust, Dalstroy, had another priority: building roads from the coast to the interior to secure supplies and then transport gold back to the west. This meant that the Zeks had to brave their first Kolyma winter in tents. Again, numbers are not clear, but apparently by early 1933, half of those 12,000 had died of exposure, hypothermia, frostbite, or other consequences of the extreme cold. The frigid conditions did not spare the guards or even their dogs. It's no surprise that by this stage the gold mined in 1932 amounted to only 500 kilograms. 1933 was still dedicated to expanding the road network and other infrastructure. Only in 1934 had Dalstroy established basic conditions for human survival under the direction of Eduard Petrovich Berzin. Berzin was Dalstroy's first director. He was a Bolshevik of the old guard and a former bodyguard to Lenin. He had a solid reputation for being a pragmatist who could get a job done, and so he did. From 1934 to 1938, he managed to double gold production year on year. He also succeeded in completing the construction of the main road that was required to supply the mines and transport extracted minerals, a strip of asphalt connecting Navego Bay with the town of Seimchan, 900 kilometers to the north. Berzin ensured the Zeks had decent rations and even a basic pay, which were luxuries compared to other gulags around the Soviet Union. But don't get me wrong, the Kolyma camps were no Club Med under Berzin. On one occasion, some mining equipment had sunk in the freezing waters of Navego Bay. He did not think twice before sending prisoners to their icy deaths to recover the equipment. That was a special case, but day-to-day activities were no less brutal. A typical daily routine in one of the Kolyma gulags might have looked like this. 6 a.m., wake-up call. 6:30, breakfast, thin soup and a small allowance of stale bread. Food rations were proportioned to work output. Prisoners who didn't meet quotas received less and less food until they starved to death. 7 a.m., roll call. 7:30 a.m., march to the road under construction or to the mines. This took 1.5 hours. 9 a.m. to 6 p.m., 9 hours of continuous, intense physical work. 6 p.m., march back to the camp, another hour and a half. 7:30 p.m., dinner. 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. after dinner camp work. This involved more manual labor, such as shoveling snow or repairing equipment. 11 p.m., lights out. This was a total of 15 hours of intense physical activity in the freezing cold, with food providing a minimal calorie intake. Clearly, thousands of prisoners died of exhaustion and starvation while building the Kolyma roads. Bodies piling up by the road was a common sight. In winter, the layer of permafrost was too hard to dig graves, and so the corpses were simply buried underneath a thin layer of soil on the roadside. Alternatively, sometimes they were just buried directly under the roads and covered in a layer of asphalt. This is the story behind the macabre name of one of these roads that's still in use today. It's the R504 Kolyma Highway, also known as the Road of Bones. In early 1938, Berzin was recalled to Moscow. The director of Dalstroy had done well and deserved a reward. But it was a trap. Berzin had fallen under the crosshairs of the NKVD for totally unknown reasons, and he was to be purged. He was shot by the secret police at their Moscow headquarters in the Lubyanka prison on August 1st, 1938. The Great Purge was due to hit Kolyma too. Berzin's successor was one K.A. Pavlov, more of a bookkeeper than a prison warden. It was his chief enforcer who became the real terror of Kolyma. This was Colonel Stepan Nikolaevich Garanin, who reported directly to the new head of the NKVD, Nikolai Yezhov. Yezhov ensured that thousands of purged enemies of the state were sent to the Kolyma camps, and Garanin ensured that they never left. The definition of enemies of the state was quite broad, and it included troops who had returned from the Spanish Civil War. According to a witness account, some Soviet pilots were sent to Kolyma, their only crime having not won the war against the Francoists. As soon as they arrived, Garanin walked out of his office to meet them, and he shot them all, one by one, with his pistol. Garanin was responsible for organizing an anomaly that contributes to Kolyma's unique character, the camp of Serpent Tinka. Earlier, I mentioned that the gulags were never designed as extermination camps, but, well, there are always exceptions, and Serpent Tinka was one of them. This was the only Kolyma camp, and probably the only gulag in the USSR, where prisoners were specifically sent to be executed. Garanin's reign of terror, it didn't last long though, as he became the victim of the very system he had served in. In 1939, Stalin realized that the Great Purge had weakened the military and industrial capabilities of the Soviet Union. Productivities at Kolyma had also been greatly reduced. Now, a great man always has a scapegoat handy, and, well, so did Stalin. He accused Yezhov and his associates of having damaged the nation with their excesses. The head of the NKVD and all of the Garanins of the country were purged in the following year, either shot in Lubyanka or sent to die in a gulag. After Garanin was sent to another Siberian camp, Kolyma prisoners enjoyed a brief period of respite before things got bad again. In June of 1941, the Axis invasion of the Soviet Union dragged the country into the Great Patriotic War. This meant that what little supplies and food the prisoners could receive had to be diverted to the war effort. Mortality rates among the Kolyma Zeks became so high that Foreign Minister Molotov himself had to intervene, demanding better conditions. Quite the humanitarian. Or actually not, he was only worried about the decline in gold output. That may explain why, when Molotov negotiated the Lend-Lease agreement with the US government, he secured a supply of excavators and bulldozers to increase mining production. Prisoner Varlan Shalamov, who would later become a writer, described the arrival of the first American mechanical beasts, some Caterpillar bulldozers. Their first use upon arriving in Kolyma was to dig mass graves in the permafrost. The spirit of cooperation between the US and USSR was cemented by the official visit of American Vice President Henry Wallace to Kolyma in 1944. He was welcomed by General Nekrasov, then director of the Dalstroy. Somehow, Nekrasov managed to put on a show that impressed Wallace. All the prisoners were rounded up and kept indoors in towns and camps away from the official visit. Barbed wire was also removed. As Wallace was an ex-farmer, he wanted to visit the collective farm providing food for the miners. Nekrasov also had the prisoners in the camps removed and replaced by the teenage children of NKVD agents as they looked healthier. The ruse worked. Wallace publicly praised Nekrasov and even published a book about the marvels of the Dalstroy operations. At the end of the war, Soviet leadership rewarded returning POWs with yet another purge. The Red Army soldiers who had been prisoners of the Axis were suspected of having been turned into capitalist double agents, and so thousands of them were sent to dig for gold in Kolyma. This influx of ex-soldiers within the camps changed one of the recurring dynamics amongst the Zeks, the clean-cut separation between common criminals and political prisoners, with the latter often suffering at the hands of the former. Now the veterans of the army that had beaten the Axis back to Berlin were filling the ranks of the political Zeks. It didn't take long before full-scale riots erupted in which the bullying criminals were severely beaten in a major reversal of fortunes. By 1948, Dalstroy authorities were so concerned about these riots that the two categories of prisoners were kept in separate camps. These measures did not prevent other types of riots from erupting, though. This is when the prisoners revolted against their guards. In a famous incident, a group of Zeks decided to take over a transit camp at the port of Magadan. After taking most of the guards hostage, they assaulted the last watchtower manned by the NKVD. The soldiers on the tower mowed down many of the rioters with their machine guns. When they ran out of ammunition, they were lynched. In addition to active violent revolts, Zeks across Kolyma and the rest of the Gulag System enacted constant passive resistance. This included slowing down work on purpose or sabotaging production output. After the death of Stalin in 1953, his successor Nikita Khrushchev realized that the whole Gulag system was an inefficient, unprofitable monster. In parallel with his policies of de-Stalinization, the new Soviet leader decided to get rid of the labor camps. During the Stalin era, approximately 18 million Soviet citizens had been imprisoned in a gulag, with 1.5 million not surviving the experience. 8% of all prisoners were killed. During the Khrushchev era, Gulag population steadily declined. More than 1.5 million Zeks were released from 1953 to 1956. The concept of forced labor for political dissidents was not completely abandoned, but it never became as intense and as widespread as it had been under Stalin. From 1968 to 1986, only about 2,500 prisoners were sent to labor camps. The process had obvious impacts on Kolyma. During the second half of the 1950s, the Gulag organization was dissolved in the region and the mining trust Dalstroy was restructured. Its leadership was rid of NKVD officers who were transferred to regular police, and their positions were replaced with civilians. The all-powerful Dalstroy, which controlled its own air force and navy at its peak, was gradually stripped of all its assets and functions. By 1958, it became what it was meant to have been in the first place, an actual mining company. 10 years later, Dalstroy was officially dissolved and the mines came under the direct authority of the Ministry of Natural Resources. Since then, Kolyma has gone through a lengthy process of healing, trying to shake off its image as a poster boy for the land of the Gulag. And with this video, I suppose we're really not helping. The Soviet government paid good incentives to volunteers who were willing to relocate to the remote cities of the region to start a new life in mining. Many of the former prisoners and guards decided to settle in Magadan and other surrounding towns, sometimes living as close neighbors. Earlier in the video, I mentioned Varlam Shalamov, the eventual writer who spent 14 years in Kolyma for being a Trotskyist sympathizer. Shalamov is less known or celebrated than Alexander Solzhenitsyn, author of the Gulag Archipelago, but Shalamov deserves to be remembered for the powerful prose he wrote during and after his sentence. A good place to start if you want to discover Shalamov's work is What I Saw and Learned in the Kolyma Camps. His book is a list of 46 teachings that Varlam brought with him after his soul-destroying experience. Some are reflections on the darkest depths of the human condition. I learned that spite is the last human emotion to survive. A starving man has only enough flesh to feel spite. He is indifferent to everything else. I learned why a man lives neither on hope, there are no hopes at all, nor on will, what will, but only on the instinct of self-preservation, the same as a tree, a rock, an animal. Shalamov learned about the true manifestations of devotion and love. I saw that women are more honest and selfless than men. There was not a single husband at Kolyma who came after his wife, but wives did come. Many did. He even found reasons to hope within the strength of the individual. I would like to close with his teaching number 20, as it is our favorite one. My body and spirit proved to be stronger in this great trial than I thought, and I am proud to have betrayed no one, to have sent no one to death, nor to the camp, to have denounced no one. So I'm not going to ask if you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it informative. If you did, please do give us a thumbs up below, and don't forget to subscribe. We got brand new videos a couple of times a week, so hit that notification bell to find out when we put out a new video. And as always, thank you for watching.